First of all, thank you very much for coming out tonight. I wasn't expecting this, many people, so I'm really pleased to see you here. We'll go ahead and get started with this little clip. It's only about 4 or 5 minutes, and some of you may have already seen it, but I anticipate probably most of you haven't. This is Bill Nye talking about what he thinks about philosophy. So here we go.
Hey Bill, Mike here. I'm a philosophy major in college right now, and I'm looking for your opinion on the subject. Some of the scientists like Stephen Hawking and Neil deGrasse Tyson have brushed it off as a meaningless topic. I'm just wondering about your thoughts on the subject.
Mike, this is a great question. I'm not sure that Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins, two guys I'm very well acquainted with, have declared philosophy as irrelevant and blown it off in your terms. I think that they're just concerned that it doesn't always give an answer that's surprising. It doesn't always lead you someplace that is inconsistent with common sense. And it often gets back to this question: what is the nature of consciousness? Can we know that we know? Are we aware that we are aware? Are we not aware that we are aware? Is reality real or is reality not real? And we are all living on a ping pong ball that's part of a giant interplanetary ping pong game that we cannot sense it. These are interesting questions. But the idea that reality is not real, or what you sense and feel is not authentic, is something I'm very skeptical of. I mean, I think that your senses and the reality that you interact with light, heat, sense of touch, taste, smell, hearing, absolute hearing, these are real things. And to make a philosophical argument that they may not be real because you can't prove, like for example, you can't prove that the sun will come up tomorrow. Not really, right? You can't prove it till it happens. But I'm pretty confident it'll happen. It's part of my reality. The sun will come up tomorrow. And so philosophy is important for a while, but it's also, I get where Neil and Richard might be coming from, I call him Richard, might be coming from, where you start arguing in a circle, where I think, therefore I am. What if you don't think about it? Do you not exist anymore? You probably still exist, even if you're not thinking about existence. And so, this gets into the old thing. If you drop a hammer on your foot, is it real or is it just your imagination? You can run that test, a couple times, and I hope you come to agree that it's probably real. It's a cool question. It's important, I think, for a lot of people to be aware of philosophy, but just keep in mind, if you spend all this money in college, this also may be where Neil and Richard are coming from. Philosophy degree may not lead you on a career path. It might, but it may not. And keep in mind, humans made up philosophy too. Humans discovered or invented the process of science. Humans invented language. Humans invented philosophy. So keep that in mind, that when you go to seek an absolute truth, you're a human seeking the truth, so there's going to be limits. But there's also going to be things beyond which it doesn't matter. Drop the hammer on your foot and see if you don't notice it.
Don't try that at home. All right. Okay. So I showed you that because that was from a couple of months ago, and it's sometimes painful for me to watch because I'm a fan of Bill Nye. I think what he does is great. I've seen him speak publicly before, but he gets so much wrong about philosophy that, like I said, sometimes it's painful to watch. But here's the basic criticism, and that is that philosophy is a pointless endeavor. And here I have Neil deGrasse Tyson, another famous scientist who I am a big fan of. He has criticized philosophy, saying that it asks too many questions. and that it's distracting. And he's quoted, I'm quoting him from this interview in The Nerdist back in 2014. And then this guy, Stephen Hawking, we all know who he is, he, right, in the grand design, says that philosophy is dead. So I'm here today to say that it's not, and to talk about philosophy of science. I don't know, who knows who this is? Anybody? It is, but what character? Miracle Max, that's right. Okay, yeah, it's Miracle Max from The Princess Bride. Philosophy is only mostly dead. No, I'm just kidding. It's not even close to mostly dead. But I was putting my PowerPoint together, and I thought, oh, yeah, that'd be a funny thing to talk about. All right. But anyway, so my response, though, to these guys, and I think a lot of philosophers share similar views, so I'm going to use philosophy of science to make my case, is that the history and philosophy of science show that science and at least some kinds of philosophy are inextricably linked. They go together, and it's hard to pull them apart, and it's almost impossible. So here we go. My talk tonight is going to proceed in the following way. I'm going to talk about three major historical figures and some attitudes that go along with that. Aristotle, Descartes, and Newton. And then I'm going to talk about briefly some contemporary contributions from philosophy, just some examples that I know about that I've either contributed to or I've used contributions myself in my own work. And then I'm going to look at some contemporary questions and issues that science by itself has yet to solve. And then the last thing is the outlook, because one of the last things that Bill Nye says is that he doesn't know if this guy is going to get a job, and I just want to draw your attention to something. There's data on that, so we'll talk about that at the very end. To get started, natural philosophy, some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, is what guys like Aristotle, Newton, Descartes all did. It's what we call science now was originally natural philosophy. And it really, truly was a philosophical endeavor. The most recent historical figure I'm talking about tonight is Newton, but he thought of himself as no less of a philosopher as he was a scientist, right? In fact, the term scientist hadn't been invented yet, right? There wasn't a term scientist. So he was doing natural philosophy. And natural philosophers, scientists, seek true explanations, and that could be in the form of explaining appearances or explaining the world as it is. And those are two different things sometimes. Explaining what we see, right, at one time was the project of philosophy. And today, and especially since Newton, explaining the world as it is more what we do. And in fact, right, we'll get started with our first guy, my favorite philosopher, Aristotle, right? So Aristotle is responsible for so much in science, you know, it's hard to, I can't give him enough credit. He founded the discipline of biology, right? He didn't use the term biology, but that's what it was. He founded it in the West. He may or may not receive credit in your textbook on the first page. After the first page, they'll never mention him again, but the first page, they might mention, yeah, Aristotle founded this. Aristotle is also responsible for what we took to be the science of physics until Newton. Right, so Aristotelian physics, right, was the physics taught in the schools. Even though by the time Newton came along, we knew that it was wrong, and we knew that there was a lot of evidence to support that it was wrong, right? Still, that's what was being taught in the schools, and in part, that's what motivated Newton to come up with the calculus and redescribe the world mathematically. So Aristotle, his universe is very different from the universe that we think of today, but his explanations are credited as being the most experientially adequate explanations we've ever had and probably ever will have. And what that means is that what Aristotle came up with in terms of explanations fit our experiences much more than what our current explanations, which we think are true, right, much more than they do today. So even though Aristotle was totally wrong, right, what he what he explained, how he explained it, right, fit how we actually experience the world better than what we think the true explanations are now, right? That doesn't really fit how we experience the world. And I just wanted to say a little bit about what, Aristotle's universe looks like. So, right, motion just means change. And there's two kinds of motion, natural motion and unnatural motion, which is violent motion. And natural motion is, things change according to what they're made of. And everything on Aristotle's view is made of earth, air, fire, or water, right? Everything on the earth below the moon is made of some combination of those four things. And so, right, for example, the pencil drops, right, Aristotle's explanation for the reason why the pencil drops to the ground, it doesn't fly up, is because it's made of mostly earthy stuff. And earthy stuff, right, goes down because that's where the center of the universe is, right? And then water sits on top of earth. You can go out in the world and look at that, right? There's a puddle of water somewhere waiting for you to observe it, right? Water sits on top of the earth. And then above that is air, and then fire is last, because lightning is fire in the sky, right? So everything moves naturally according to what it's made of. Now, the violent motion, right, that's his explanation for when we move things, like if I, throw this paper clip across the room, right? Projectile motion is violent motion, unnatural motion. And he had a story on that, and that was totally wrong, but I got to get through this material. So anyway, but, and then everything changes according to causes, which we would understand more these days as be causes. So, for example, the reason why an oak grows up into a tree, a true scientific explanation includes an account in terms of, right, all of this, right? So the oak acorn, the acorn grows up into a tree because that's the form that ultimately it's got to take, because that's inside the acorn. And the final cause, or the final be cause, is the whole purpose of that thing growing. And the material cause, right, is the material explanation for why that thing grows, right, the matter. And then the efficient cause, right, the efficient cause is the explanation in terms of the immediate things that bring that change about. And so this is how Aristotle understood the universe. And when I say, right, that Aristotle understood the universe, everybody else in the West understood the universe this way until Newton. If you are in my philosophy of science class, right, you've seen this before. My favorite theoretical entity of all time to talk about is the epicycle. And I'll show you what an epicycle looks like in a minute. But this is a picture of the geocentric conception of the universe, right? The Earth is at the center. And what this is actually a picture of is the transit of Venus, right? Now, the Greeks thought, and Aristotle was Greek, of course, that everything below the moon was made of this earthy stuff, earth, air, fire, water. Anything above the moon included, was made of this perfect, mysterious stuff that didn't exist down here called the ether. That stuff up there moves perfectly and uniformly, uniform circular motion. But when we observe, right, the stuff up in the sky, it does weird things sometimes. And so they had to come up with explanations for why do we see a perfect entity like Venus move in retrograde motion. Well, the explanation is, and that's what this is a map, this is what it, right, this is what it might look like drawn out, is in terms of the epicycle. Again, my favorite theoretical entity of all time. So epicycles, right, here's the Earth at the center, right, of the universe and of the cycle, right? Epicycles are these things right here. And here would be the planet. So on the previous slide, right, here's Venus. Venus is moving in a perfect uniform manner, in a perfect circle around, right, this point, and this is called the deferent, right? And so to preserve this conception of perfection up in the sky, not just the Greeks, but a lot of other people said, okay, we're going to use these models called epicycles. Now, whether or not they really thought that epicycles were up there or out there is up for debate. Sometimes Ptolemy talks about them like they're real entities, and sometimes he doesn't. And that, this is an issue in science where, sometimes the entities that we talk about within the context of a theory, we don't necessarily need for them to really be there, but we need for them to be there as placeholders. So that's an issue, right, called realism, whether or not these entities are real or not. And this is my favorite theoretical entity because it's a great example of, right, in the history of science where, you've got Ptolemy, right, the guy who's responsible for the Ptolemaic model of the universe. That's this side. Earth is at the center, and this is how all the visible planets move, plus the sun. They've all got epicycles except for the sun, because that never looks like it's going retrograde. You've got Ptolemy going back and forth in the Almagest on whether or not epicycles are real, right? And he's not really debating, but he's talking about them like, on the one hand, it's a theoretical tool to explain the appearance, and on the other hand, it's got to be up there. So anyway, like I said, epicycles are my favorite things to talk about. On the right over here, this is our Copernican model, right? Copernicus even used epicycles. Even Newton actually published a version of his theory with an epicycle in it. He didn't need it, but he did it anyway, right? So these epicycles, right, they don't go away for a long time. We know now, that, we know what epicycles are now, that they're not real entities, right, et cetera. They're not really up there. Mercury is really not going retrograde when people are acting crazy and driving on the freeway. So, we know that. But anyway, so epicycles. So that's Aristotle and the Aristotelian worldview, right? Now we're going to move up, I don't know, what is that, about 1,800 years, to Descartes. So Descartes is another favorite of mine. Mainly because this guy is prolific. So he writes, and one of the reasons why I wanted to be sure to mention him is because Bill Nye mentions him, that the cogito, I think, therefore I am. And I wanted to explain that and save the cogito from Bill Nye because he kind of got it wrong, right? So the reference comes from this work that Descartes published called Meditations on First Philosophy, and the rest of that. And so anyway, in the Meditations, what Descartes' trying to do is to come up with a foundation for the sciences, an epistemological foundation for the sciences. And what that means is, right, a justification for scientific knowledge. That's what it means. And so the way he does it is that he goes through, you may have heard of this, radical doubt, this method of radical doubt. And he doubts the beliefs that he forms from his senses, right? And he doubts even the truths of mathematics. And maybe during the Q&A, if you want to know how he does that, I'll explain it to you. But he doubts everything that he can think of to doubt, and he gets down and he says, this is a meditation, mind you. He says, okay, the last thing I've got is I'm a thinking thing. And so if I'm a thinking thing, then, right, I can't doubt my own existence. And that's what the cogito means. That's what I think, therefore I am really means, right? So philosophers don't sit around today and ponder that. I mean, they study Descartes. We study Descartes and what he was doing with this. But, right, I think, therefore I am, that's not, that's not the point. The point Descartes was trying to get to is what is the justification for scientific knowledge? Now, why did he have to investigate this? Well, you got to take into consideration, he is a scientist too. So I started out saying, look, this is natural philosophy. He's doing science. This is the same guy, Descartes, who gave us Cartesian coordinates. If you took analytical geometry, right, you studied Descartes. They probably didn't say you're studying Descartes. You probably called it Cartesian coordinates, but this is where it comes from, right? He also did work in biology. Right? And Lamond, notice this is published almost 30 years after his death. And the reason is because that's the work where he talks about the heliocentric view. He believes in heliocentrism, that the sun is really at the center. He talks about how he thinks the body works. And this is all highly controversial given that Galileo was under house arrest, right? So he doesn't actually have this thing published until after he's dead, right? He gets part of it published. It's called The Principles of Philosophy, but not the stuff that he could, get arrested for. So anyway, so that's Descartes. And so Descartes is another example of the philosopher as scientist, right? And this is pretty standard stuff. A lot of people don't realize it, that natural philosophy, right, and science were the same thing. This guy, right? I love this guy. I can't say enough about this guy, Newton. He really is an interesting, fascinating guy. He gets to Cambridge when he's about 19 years old because his mom didn't know what to do with him. He was supposed to be a farmer and he hated farming, and he was this weird kid who invented telescopes and hung out by himself, and he did all these things. And he was just, they didn't know what to do with him. So they sent him to school. I think his uncle, right, had connections. They got him into Cambridge. He got to Trinity College, and he sits for a year and he takes notes on Aristotle. Right, and like I said, right, Aristotle was the physics, right, until Newton at Cambridge. He takes notes on Aristotle, and he says this is wrong, and so from that he invents the calculus and does all the wonderful things that we know that he did. But I wanted to point out, right, the work, right, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, right? This is where he introduces the laws of motion, universal gravitation, and the derivation of Kepler's laws of planetary motion. So this is natural philosophy, right? Science and philosophy haven't come apart just yet. Now, in our intellectual history, they do come apart after Newton, and here's why I think they do. The 19th century, what happened? The 19th century. Right, Newton's mathematical philosophy takes off. This is big, and everybody agrees with it, and everybody thinks he's right, and that this really is the better way to understand the world. And I should be careful here. Not everybody. Now, right, there are the famous Leibniz-Clark debates where a student of Newton, his name is Clark, and the philosopher Leibniz go back and forth through a series of letters, and they argue back and forth about the ultimate nature of reality. But the way Newton is able to explain phenomena in a way that it doesn't fit, that his explanation doesn't fit our experience like Aristotle's explanation does, but it makes more sense, right, given, right, his justifications. And Newton is very popular, and so popular that, right, it's called, there's a term for it, it's called mechanistic philosophy or mechanical philosophy. And I should also note something else about Descartes, and this was another reason why I put him on this presentation too. Descartes, his understanding of the body was also very mechanistic, right? So, and some of you may know this, some of you may not, but Descartes is the guy with two substances, mind and body, the mind-body dualism, that's Descartes. And so, right, the body is very much like a machine. And in fact, animals are just all body, right? So whenever animals move around, it's like moving mechanical machines. And this was all in Le Monde, right? And this was kind of the controversial stuff. But this mechanistic philosophy really took off. Now, back to my question up here, what happened? Well, the 19th century happened. And when one of the things, part of that is there was kind of a backlash to this mechanistic philosophy. What does that mean? Well, I have up here Romance science. So rather than understanding the world mathematically, right, Romance science clung to, right, more qualitative explanations. And it's during that period that chemistry and biology really take off. Chemistry from alchemy, the ancient practice of trying to transmute metals from one to another. Usually it was whatever base metals to gold, right? That's alchemists are famous for that. Newton, by the way, was an alchemist. He never let that go. So no matter how much credit we want to give Newton, we got to bear in mind that he too, thought that you could turn, nickel into gold or whatever. Also associated with alchemy is the search for like the fountain of youth, the magic elixirs to make you young, or right. Sometimes it's associated with medicine. So that's where chemistry comes from this background of alchemy, and as a reaction to mechanical philosophy. Also, the other thing that I think is relevant here is industrialization, right? So how did the disciplines split in the or why did the disciplines split in the 19th century? In part because of Romance science, but also in part because, right, we needed specialized knowledge. We needed chemists to study chemistry, right? If we wanted to learn more about chemistry and we wanted to learn more about the elements and things like that, we needed them to focus on just what chemists do. If we want to learn more about physics, we need more specialized physicists. So that's what I have to say about that. You know, this is why the disciplines split. So now the question is, I said I was going to, bring us up to, we're skipping a lot of major figures in science, and that's okay. But the question is, what have you done for me lately? So what are science and philosophy doing for us now? Because that was then, this is now, come on. Why are we, that we can appeal to Aristotle, Descartes, and Newton and say that we're great philosophers and great scientists, but, and notice that the disciplines split, but, so maybe Bill Nye's still right, or deGrasse Tyson, or Stephen Hawking, or whatever. Maybe they're still right. Maybe the disciplines split and we don't need philosophy anymore. Well, that's not true. And so I just came up, this is non-exhaustive, right? I just came up with like 4 different things where, right, philosophy has contributed to science. And the first one up there is really important. That's actually philosophy of science. The falsifiability criterion comes from Karl Popper, right? The whole idea that what makes a science and not a pseudoscience or something else, right, is the idea that that the theory is falsifiable. Even if you can't find the falsifier, it's possible to falsify it. That's from Karl Popper, a famous philosopher of science. And so I put in parentheses, right, the philosophy area, and then, right, the scientific application. That goes for all science. We don't count it as a science if it's not falsifiable. So that's the first one I have up there. The second one I have up there, Bayesian approaches to understanding cognition. So part of my dissertation is about this, right? Bayesianism, there's lots of people want to claim it, but philosophers certainly want to claim it. Logic and epistemology, there's a branch of philosophy, a branch of logic that deals with, right, the Bayesian probability theorem, if you're familiar with it. If you're not familiar with it, it's a theorem of probability that you can derive from the axioms. And what philosophers do with it is we sometimes model, I think of it as a model, but we sometimes people think that it really is what we're doing when we cognize. But we take that mathematical theorem, right, and we apply it to the way we reason. And so today, inductive logic for the most part is Bayesian logic, right? And so in philosophy. And so, right, my example up there is, right, that has been applied to cognitive science, right? So and understanding how human beings reason, particularly in situations where, right, we think that they reason poorly, right? There's explanations. There's 2 guys out of Oxford, Nick Chater and Mike Oaksford, who, right, have written about this. So that's the second one. The third one, right, possible world semantics used in linguistic analyses. Well, possible worlds, that really is a weird philosophical thing, I got to tell you. But the metaphysics of possible worlds, right, it's where philosophers try to describe whatever conditions there are, to make a possible world, what a possible world is. Is it just a thing that we think about, or is it a real entity, right? And then the semantics part, right, is the logic part. So what are the truth conditions for a possible world, right? When is a sentence true in some possible world? And that stuff has been used in linguistics in particular, right? So the possible world semantics, right, is the direct application there. And then the last one I have up there, right, this one, right, some of you may this one might be the one that people are familiar with, but rules for the ethical treatment of human and non-human animals in research. And, right, or maybe I shouldn't call them rules, maybe principles, right? I'm not sure, when I was putting this together, I wasn't really sure what to call them, but when I said you may be, this is the one that most people might be familiar with, right? So you may have heard of this guy, Peter Singer. He's actually popular. He's retired now, but he was a famous professor at Princeton, and he goes around and he gives talks, and he shows up on Bill Maher sometimes, and he does these popular things now, but that's the guy who invented applied ethics. Pretty much. And he says, I invented it because it was the late 60s, early 70s, and I was an ethicist, and I wondered why we weren't applying, right, the stuff that we do in ethics to real issues like equality. And he's famous for that, but he's also really famous for his views on animal ethics. And he's the guy, if you're not familiar, he's the guy who wrote the book Animal Liberation. So anyway, that's been applied, right, that kind of thing has been applied to all the sciences. Any science that uses a human as a test subject, or a human or an animal as a test subject, right, has been influenced by that. So those are just 4 candidates. But I also said, I wanted to talk about some open philosophical questions in science. And again, this is just a list that I came up with. Part of the reason why I put them on the list is because I think they're interesting questions. But I also think that, right, you need a philosopher in there somewhere to help answer the question. Science alone isn't going to be able to do it. So the first one up there, what's consciousness? And actually I snuck a second question in there. What kinds of things have it? Because if we can figure out what it is, then we can say what things have it and what things don't. And then that's going to inform a lot of other things that we do, right? So if we think that an animal like a cat or a dog has consciousness, or a cow, or, right, a chicken, then, right, that's going to inform how we treat it, right? Either as a pet or as a thing for food or whatnot. Second question, right? Does the evidence of varying moral values in anthropology entail relativism? This is a really important question, right? The evidence says that different cultures have different values, right? And sometimes there's overlap, right? And that it's important, I think, to recognize that. But right, there are differences. So does that really mean that morality just is relative and anything goes, or is there something else? Right? And again, I think you need a philosopher to help answer that question. Facts alone aren't going to do it. What about the third one? What's the best form of government? That's a great question. I don't know. The next one, what exactly is a cause? So causality is deeply philosophical, and it takes a minute sometimes to stop and think about that. What, cause, effect, and that relation. There's been lots of ink spilled over the years from philosophers and scientists about causality. And I don't know what else to say about it other than, right, if you ever take my philosophy of science class, we'll talk about that. So there you go. This one right here, the objects of math, what are the objects of mathematics? So this is another thing that, is a deeply philosophical question that there was no math class that I ever took, and I took a lot of math classes, where we ever stopped to think about, like, what exactly is a number, right? Now, why would that be important? Well, if our best scientific theories are mathematical, then what a number is, right, really would make a difference, right? Is it a real entity that exists independent of human beings and human cognition, or is it somehow tied to our cognition, right? And so that would be the kind of question associated with that one right there. What are the objects? What are these things, right? Are they real entities? Are they merely theoretical? Are they fictions, right? What are they? And then, right, the last one, that's a particularly favorite question of mine. How seriously should we take the metaphors used in science? So our scientific theories are just chock full of metaphors, and they're so chock full of metaphors, we don't even realize how the metaphor while we're using it. And one of my favorite examples of this is DNA code. Now, I like to point this out that that's merely metaphoric, because if you look under a microscope at DNA, you're not literally going to see an A, a C, a T, a G, right? So it's a metaphor. But it's a very useful metaphor, and I'm not going to lie to you. I don't want to get rid of it. I want to keep it. But we have to recognize that it's a metaphor, and this, right, goes back to the philosophy. How seriously should we take, right, these metaphors that we use? Okay. Some specific questions for sciences, because those were some general ones, but here's some specific ones that I think are open. And I'm not going to read them to you, but those were some that I came up with for the big three: physics, chemistry, and biology. And then, right, the last thing I want to talk about tonight, and this goes back to the thing that Bill Nye said, to the guy majoring in philosophy, what was it that he said? I don't think you're going to be able to make a career of it, or something like that. And I'll tell you the truth about that. It really is hard to get a job in philosophy. It is difficult. But there are some advantages to studying philosophy and some of the other humanities as well. One of the things that I've done in the past is I've given talks about, the usefulness and the value of philosophy. And so, right, before I get into like the cash value, because I've got something to show you about that, I just want to point out, like when you study philosophy, you get to think carefully about big ideas. This might be the only time in your life in college that you actually have the time to do it, right? So take advantage of it. Because when you take on other responsibilities, like that you don't always have time to sit around and think about these things. You also get to analyze and critically assess arguments. So this is an opportunity for you as a student to get to think about, right, the arguments put forth for your favorite or maybe your non-favorite positions, right? So suppose you're familiar with the argument. What's a good one? Suppose you're familiar with the argument that evolution is false because of chance, right? Because it's too improbable or something like that. This is the time in a philosophy class, a philosophy of science class, where you would get to sit and think about how good of an argument that is, whether it's a good one or whether it's a bad one, and why. And then, right, one of the nice things about studying philosophy is it really does help you learn how to write clearly about complex topics. And that's a skill that transfers over into other careers. And this is I hate to make the appeal to money, but I'm going to make the appeal to money. So this is actually from PayScale, and this was as of last March. So mid-career median salary for philosophy majors is this, and it beats out these other guys. Now, of course, chemical engineers are going to make a lot of money, right? But philosophers don't do so bad either. So to Bill Nye, I want to say, a big fan, but you're just wrong, Bill. You're just wrong. And to the fellow majoring in philosophy, he does stand a chance to do well enough. And one last thing, look carefully. And that's what I've got. All right. Thank you. Yes.
When you said that Descartes questioned the truth of mathematics, can you just give us a quick example?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the way he doubted the truths of mathematics is he pretended that there was this evil demon that was influencing him to believe, right, that, say, 2 + 2 = 4, but in fact it really doesn't, right? So it's called the demon argument, right, where your best rationalization says that this has got to be the case, 2 + 2 = 4, but, right, suppose there's some evil demon manipulating us such that, right, 2 + 2 doesn't really equal 4, it equals something else, right? And that's how he did it. And the way he got out of that, because the cogito isn't enough, right? It's the foundation. But the way he got out of that is he appeals to God. Well, God's not a deceiver. God wouldn't let that happen. So, right, the truths of mathematics have to be right. And that's how he does it. So, yeah. Yes, yeah.
I assume maybe because of time compression, you kind of skipped over Galileo, you mentioned him
Oh, yeah,
briefly.
yeah.
How would you put him into this sequence, like, because Newton always claimed how much Galileo influenced?
Right, yeah. No, that's a great question. So Galileo, yeah, I specifically wanted to focus on like the ones that the philosophers always want to claim. But yeah, very influential. In fact, I'm on the side that thinks Galileo really did figure out gravity before Newton, and Newton kind of claimed it. But yeah. So Galileo, yeah, I did skip over him, but he. In the history and philosophy of science, he's very important, but philosophers just don't want to glom onto Galileo. But yeah, that's why I did that. Okay, so here's the thing. Let me go back. So let me give you an example, because philosophers, so in the chemistry example up there, when we come up with an answer in philosophy, the justification for the answer is the most important, right? So when you say, has a philosopher come up with an answer? The answer is yes, but it depends on what philosopher you're talking to. So like that question up there, are elements natural kinds, and if so, are they the only ones? I have an answer for that, right? And my answer is, to the first part, is yeah, they're natural kinds, and to the second part is I don't know. But, right, there's a lot of people who think I'm wrong, but I think I have some pretty good reasons to think that, right? So in philosophy, to come up with a definitive answer I think that you're lying to yourself if you think you've come up with a definitive answer. So like other questions, what's consciousness? Well, I don't think that's solely up to philosophers. I think we need scientists for that. But I mean, I'm also saying is like, look, right? These are also philosophical questions that we need philosophers for too. And I'm sure there's a very famous philosopher, David Chalmers, who he thinks he has an answer, or well, he thinks he's got a partial answer. But again, right? And he's very smart, very well informed, and all that. But I mean, again, right? We just don't. It's having a definitive answer is not as important as having the right justification. And then, we think we've got a definitive answer, but it could still turn out, right? I believe in epistemic humility, right? The intellectual humility. It could still turn out that we're wrong. So, yes.
Would you say, or would you characterize philosophy as a bridge between religion and science?
No. No. So at one time, it might have been, but here's the thing. So I talked about natural philosophy. So somebody one time asked me, well, what's unnatural philosophy? And I said, theology. It's supernatural. It really was. Right. You went to school Newton, when he went to Cambridge, right? He studied natural philosophy and he studied theology, right? And that's what you did at the time. And so right, I don't think now philosophy functions like that. Now there are parts of philosophy that deal with religion, right? Philosophy of religion. And there are, right, societies of religious philosophers and things like that. But these days, right, just as a discipline, the discipline of philosophy, I'm not sure is really a bridge, a bridge between, right, science and religion.
I guess I was thinking more of the people like Descartes, Aristotle.
Well, so Aristotle, we got to be careful not to like retroactively make Aristotle like a Christian or anything like that. He's an ancient Greek guy, and so Aquinas tried to do that, right? Tried to turn Aristotle into a Christian, and but Descartes. So there's a lot of discussion about Descartes and whether or not he really believed that God argument, right? So. Right, he was a 17th century Catholic, right? So that's true, but whether or not he really thought that argument was a good argument, and he was, or he was just saying it so that he wouldn't go under house arrest, right? God's not a deceiver, right? I don't want what happened to Galileo to happen to me, right? There's a lot of debate about whether or not he really believed that. I think that I'm not sure that thinking about it like in terms of a bridge between the two, I'm not sure that there's always necessarily a need for like a dichotomy, like it's science or religion, right? And there's no overlap. Because even Neil deGrasse Tyson has said, you know, that he thinks that the intellectual endeavor of science is a spiritual practice, right? He's said stuff like that. And so, you know, I'm not so sure that you know, it has to be that one or the other. So, yeah. And I don't think that, you know, philosophy necessarily functions as that middle point. So, like, because the kind of philosophy that I do, logic, epistemology, and philosophy of science, right? It may be some kind of spiritual endeavor in terms of Neil deGrasse, you know, what Neil deGrasse Tyson says, right? In that sense, but it doesn't have anything to do with religion or anything like that. So, yes.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas made a distinction between divine knowledge and scientific or empirical knowledge.
Yeah.
Right? So, would you classify Thomas Aquinas as a theologian or a philosopher?
Both, sure, because if you read the Catechism, that's Aquinas, and it really comes from Aristotle. But yeah, I mean that's yeah, I mean he's both, right? So Aquinas was a philosopher and a theologian, and so that's an example of a guy who does both. And there are people who do that today. There are theologians who are also philosophers as well, but not all of philosophy is necessarily involved in theology, right? Contemporary philosophy, right? So in my case, I could have gone through all of graduate school without ever taking a philosophy of religion class. I didn't, but I mean, I did take a philosophy of religion class, but I could have, right? Just like a lot of people who go to graduate school, right? They could go through and get their PhDs and never take a philosophy of science class, right? So, I mean, that's why I was saying there's not necessarily any overlap today, right? If you want to overlap, you have to put yourself in the overlap. Anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned your areas of philosophy as perhaps having a spiritual dimension. What is spirit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer for that. I was referring to what deGrasse Tyson talks about, how he feels about science, and in that way, you know, as a spiritual endeavor, it makes me feel connected to the universe, and that's what he's talking about. But what is spirit? I have no idea. I have no idea. Anything else? Yeah.
But in the field of philosophy, I know that there's just so many arguments, and they're all great and like very deep. So how, like, what is the process to kind of determine what's the most, I guess, accurate? I know that may not exist because if there's something, if someone writes like an argument and they have all the proper reasoning, then it's justified.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like some of the reasons why maybe it's not viewed in like a sciencey way is because there are so many like valid arguments. So it's like what can we take from that and say like this is it?
That's a great point. You know, evidence is my answer, and then, but also, you know, the issue of evaluating evidence. What counts as good evidence? First of all, what counts as evidence, and then secondly, what counts as good evidence? So, you know, that itself is subject to evaluation. I'm not going to lie and say, you know, that you know, we know what evidence is all the time and then what counts as good evidence, because we don't. We have to evaluate it, and then that takes more justifications. But my quick response to you is evidence. Is how do you know which theory is more true or which theory is more right? Is based on, you know, well, what does the evidence say? Yeah.
What about cash value?
Yeah, whatever works. Well, that's a pragmatic approach. Yeah, and
Dewey.
yeah, Dewey, sure. Well, even I think Dewey though would appeal to evidence, right? And so I'm not. Yeah. But yeah, the pragmatic approach certainly works. Yeah.
You said that Descartes spoke of demons in the 17th century. So back then, maybe people believed in those more so than today. Do you know what the reason is that today people might not believe in that as so much?
Might not believe in demons today? Oh, well, I'm not sure Descartes, I mean, so this was just a thought experiment, right? So Descartes just said, okay, this is how I'm going to doubt the truths of mathematics. I mean, and you could do this too. You know, we don't need evil demons. We could just think about the matrix, right? How do you know we're not in the matrix? Bam, there you're doubting, you know, like, and you don't have somebody, you know, manipulating you to think that 2 + 2 = 4. There you go. There's your doubt. But I honestly don't know how to answer that question. Like, why do we not think that demons existed? I would say evidence.
Have the
you know?
demons somehow won
Huh?
and succeeded in making us think they don't exist? Or do they actually truly not?
Oh yeah, are we being double deceived, like a double blind experiment but with deception? I don't know. That's a good question. I'm going to have to say I don't know, and then maybe we'll take this up in class. So, okay. Anyone else? All right. Well, if that's it, thank you very much.
Thank you.